Hello, nerds. Nerds for humanity. We are back in the nerd zone. And I've got Mike Termott with me, who is running for president as a libertarian. And we are going to get to know Mike through a casual discussion about a lot of current events, hot topics to kind of get his take on things. But before we do that, I do want to just welcome you to the show, Mike, and give you an opportunity to give a quick introduction to yourself before we dive in.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's a great joy to be with you and with your fellow nerds. I think I'm in good company. I have always identified as a nerd myself, and as someone who cares deeply about humanity, I think we're all on the same page. You got it right. I'm running for the presidential nomination of my party, the Libertarian Party. I am doing that for a couple different reasons. Number one, I think that we all recognize we have a huge opportunity in 2024 to really play an important role in American politics. Indeed, our objective is to disrupt the other party's ability to just continue to disregard our values, our party, our politics, and continue with, business as usual, because I think that our government has gone off the rails. I also feel like it's an obligation for our party to get this right. Our party, the Libertarian Party, is, after all, the philosophical descendant of the people that put together the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, our federal government, and did so for the one legitimate purpose of protecting our civil liberties. And I do not believe that a Republican politician or a Democratic politician is likely in the next coming decades to lead the charge back toward a constitution of delimited powers. And so I think it's up to us as libertarians to do so. I'm a professional economist, have worked as a professional economist for more than a couple of decades. This is my claim to your world of nerddom. And as a second career, from 2010 to 2021, from the age of 49 to 60, I worked as a police officer in South Florida in Broward County. I was on the road for 11 and a half years, all as a registered libertarian. And this is the reason I spend so much time talking about the need to reform the way that we manage police officers, the way that we manage police agencies, and the profound changes that we need to make to our criminal justice system in general. So that's a little bit of background. And let me just say, I'm totally pleased to be with you.
Well, I appreciate it, Mike. Tell me a little bit about your role as a professional economist. Where were you? What types of economic kind of problems or analyses were you doing?
What the heck was I doing? I grew up in the commercial banking industry. I was an engineer by training, but I went to business school and then went to commercial finance with a couple of banks in and around New York. Went back to graduate school. I studied at a very free market oriented program at the George Washington University, which put me in good stead. That's where I earned a master's degree and a PhD in economics, focusing on international trade and focusing on free markets. I went to work for a couple of different government agencies. I worked for the White House for a couple of years in the Office of Management and Budget. I spent almost a decade as a professional advocate in the financial services industries, advocate for freer markets, for less regulation, for greater competition. And then I spent almost a decade managing my own business. A partner of mine and I launched a business in strategic consulting and providing educational opportunities for executives mostly in the financial services businesses. I taught economics at 3 different universities here in Florida, as well as that's how I worked my way through graduate school, of course, at GW. So been around the block a little bit, spent a lot of time in finance, a lot of time in international, spent a lot of time traveling. And that's what my background was like when I became a police officer.
Yeah, that is quite a transition from economist to police officer, especially as a libertarian. I have to confess that I do watch some YouTube channels that have like police badge cams and observe how the police conduct themselves, traffic stops and things like that. Did you feel a little bit conflicted? Because there are times where the police will ask you to give up your rights without you maybe knowing what you have a right to do or what you can and can say no to.
Absolutely not conflicted. I'm a big believer in public service. Police work is at its core public service. If it's done right, it's done with the dedication to protecting your civil liberties. That is the difference between good police work and bad police work. You're right. I was a registered libertarian for the entire time that I was a police officer. And I was lucky. I was able to find an agency that had a separate vice unit, so I didn't have to be involved in those areas that I consider particularly stupid and counterproductive, in terms of the war on drugs, for example, or the stings in the prostitution business and stuff like that. I didn't have to get involved with any of that. I had an agency that had its own traffic unit, so I didn't have to get involved with the silliness of so many communities are bent on asking quotas to be met by police officers in order to raise revenue. I didn't have to be involved with that silliness. The vast majority of police officers and the vast majority of police cases are managed in a way that does honor people's civil liberties. There are occasions on which things go wrong. Police officers have enormous latitude in terms of how individual cases go. And it is my contention that the number one reason that we need to impose profound changes in the industry of policing is to better hold police officers accountable. Better training, of course, but also holding police officers accountable when mistakes are made. And this reason, I think that we can do a much better job of allowing communities to impose their values on the way that their police agencies are operated.
What is your take on body cams with police officers? I generally assume, from an outsider's point of view, like more information is good. What was it like being on the other side of that badge with the camera on all the time?
Well, it is a good thing from the community point of view. And I think that in many cases, officers appreciate exactly why it's done. And these days, anyone who joins police work does so knowing that you're going to be wearing a camera. So it's not like it's a surprise, right? Cameras were introduced after I was already into my career as a police officer. So there is a little bit of adjustment. You become aware in a way that maybe you hadn't been before, that everyone is able to watch you, but that is not a bad thing. It does hold police officers accountable. And by the way, there are plenty of circumstances when not only are citizens protected from police officers and police departments making mistakes and doing things wrong, but police officers protected as well when they're accused of things that aren't true, for example. Those are frequent. And, when I have conversations with police officers, I make that point up front, that there are occasions when cameras can be absolutely your best friend.
What is your take on, there's been some news reporting lately about the National Guard being deployed to the New York subway system. I'd be curious, what is a libertarian's view on this? Because as a citizen that believes that people should be able to travel safely and, not be pushed onto the tracks and stuff like that, I kind of feel like, hey, it's good. It's good that there's a little more law enforcement around. On the other hand, I've heard some people say, hey, this is intimidating, like people with long guns and, and military fatigues walking around, yada, yada. What's your take on that?
Well, it's both, isn't it? I mean, you do have a right to be safe. And this is the reason why communities develop criminal justice systems in the first place and pay for a police force. We want police agencies to be more held to account, not less. And when you bring in the National Guard from outside of your community, individuals who are not trained in police work, individuals that have not been trained in how your community wants officers to behave, it's a recipe for disaster, right? And I'm not even suggesting that it was necessarily a bad idea. I mean, communities got to do what they got to do to preserve safety. I'm not trying to be insensitive to the reasons why these decisions are made, but it is a recipe for disaster to bring in untrained individuals and expect that all of a sudden they're going to understand how these interactions are supposed to be handled. So I worry, I am skeptical. If the training is there, understanding what weapons are to be used, and most importantly, what weapons are not to be used in the vast majority of situations, which is to say no weapons at all should be used. If that training is in place, then all good. But a tremendous amount of training has to go into the idea of aligning community values with the policies and protocols of police officers. And you just don't have that opportunity when you bring in the National Guard.
I have heard that a lot of police departments are struggling to recruit and retain talent. A lot of people like left the force and then they're not able to backfill. What is your sense? Like, do you think we should raise salaries to kind of attract more talent, or what's the right approach to police resourcing?
Well, it's not a matter of should we, right? Markets determine this. And yes, if communities want to hire more police officers, they're going to figure out what combination of higher pay, higher benefits, or better training, or better ways of holding police accountable. They're going to have to figure out the mix to attract police officers. There's no question about that. Look, there's a couple of things going on that have discouraged police officers. Some of them good, some of them bad, right? If you joined police departments 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, with the idea, oh, I'm not going to have to wear a camera, I'm going to have a great deal of latitude, not be held to account, I'm going to make the same amount of money whether I work hard or don't work hard, whether I'm a good police officer or a bad police officer. And I like that. Now, I'm not describing most police officers, but there are a certain number that fall into that category. If that's you, yeah, you're going to be discouraged by a lot of the changes that are going on in police culture and going on in the way that police officers and police agencies are managed. The fact that we've lost some of those officers, to be honest, that's not a bad thing, right? It is true that we have had problems with the relationship between police departments and communities. Part of that is because police cultures have to make changes that they haven't made yet. Part of that is true from the police officer's point of view. There is a great deal of media that likes to make hay out of beating up on police agencies. Some of that police officers have earned, and some of that is just, gratuitous clickbait. I get that. I'm not insensitive to the officer's point of view here. All of these things need to be worked through. These are cultural changes that we're going through. And like any set of cultural changes, it's going to take some time. But we're going the right direction. We are not to be discouraged. There are certain things that we can do to accelerate that. We need to get rid of qualified immunity and replace it with requirements for officers to carry their own liability insurance. We need ways of preventing the very powerful police unions from shutting down transparency and holding officers accountable. We need differentiated pay. We need greater competition. Perhaps most importantly, we need competition at the agency level so that a community can fire its whole agency if it wants to and hire a different agency from the public sector or the private sector. So there's a lot of changes that will be made over the next decade and that need to be made.
Super interesting topic. And I know we could spend a lot of time on law enforcement. I do also want to touch on some other topics. Mike, you mentioned that you're running in the Libertarian Party primary. I must confess that I've been fixated on the other primaries. What is the status of the Libertarian primary? The other two parties, they've kind of wrapped it up already. Where are you guys at on picking your nominee?
We choose a nominee at an open convention in May. Our convention is earlier than the other parties, but because it is an open convention, it is not settled until then, right? We don't have delegates that are pledged to one candidate or another. This is decided at the convention at the end of May. And so because it is an open convention, we don't have a nominee until then, whereas the other parties effectively, not officially, right? Republican Party, Democratic Party, they don't officially have nominees yet, but unofficially, we now know who those nominees are going to be. So in some sense, it feels like the general election has already started for those candidates in those parties, and we have not really engaged that yet and won't for another couple of months.
Oh, so interesting. So the Libertarian Party, you all don't have like a run up of, a collection of states and dole out the delegates along the way. You guys, is it in May? It's like everybody starts from the same place, and then the delegates there kind of do a round of voting. Is that how that works?
Absolutely. Multiple rounds of voting until someone has a majority. The way conventions used to be until delegates were pledged in advance in popular vote primaries.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it isn't this like theatrical production, but there's really uncertainty going into that convention.
It's total uncertainty and no theatrics about it whatsoever. It is actual work, actual voting, and it actually matters. So our delegates have an opportunity to do whatever they want in terms of voting once we get there.
And do all the candidates get like speaking opportunities, or are there debates within the Libertarian? Like, how do you guys do all that?
Each state has its own convention at which the states pick their delegates, but their delegates are not pledged to any one particular candidate. But at those conventions, which are typically held in person, typically, not in every case, but in most cases, the state party invites the candidates to come and address the delegates, either through, speaking opportunities, or in many cases, a debate among the candidates, which are very fun. In this sense, all of the candidates, all of us have gotten to know each other and become friends. We metaphorically punch each other in the nose during the debates, of course, because there are real differences, but it is a terrific group of individuals. And so no matter who is chosen, we'll have a good representative of the party. I believe both, if I may be perfectly candid, it is likely, but not certain, that I will be the nominee. And I believe that that is not a bad thing for our party.
Yeah. Well, how hard was it to be considered for the nomination? I know in the other parties, it's actually really expensive, and the party kind of has their favorites already lined up. How do you guys do it? Like, what are the requirements to run?
Although the primaries do change some minds sometimes, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, don't they? In years past, we've learned a lot through the process, notwithstanding what we, you go back to 2016 and you think, we really thought we were going to have another member of the Bush family leading the charge. And we found out lickety split that wasn't going to be the case. Inside the Libertarian Party, it is a lot of work. There is some serious money involved from the individual point of view, but it's on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions, that is spent getting your message out to the delegates, traveling to the various conventions, of which there are dozens and dozens of other meetings. And of course, you do a lot of podcasts, not unlike this one. There are a lot of podcasts inside the Libertarian Party that help get your message out as well.
How do we differentiate between the Libertarian candidates? Because I have this caricature of what Libertarians are for. I'm not sure what are the differences between Mike Termott and the other folks that are looking for the nomination?
Two big points of differentiation come up when you consider what we have to do differently than we did in the past regarding our typical presidential national campaign. Number one, we have to run, I believe, on a very principles forward platform, a very differentiated platform, one that has very little, I would argue, no overlap with the Republican Party platform or the Democratic Party platform, but is used to completely differentiate us and let people know that there's a very different choice available. So there are candidates who would not see it quite that way, perhaps wish that the platform was used to reach as many people as possible rather than, in my view, correctly branding the party based on our principles, a little bit more, as you might say, hardcore dedication to our principles. And there are also individuals who might differentiate regarding the way that we articulate those. For example, I believe that it's important that we talk about our principles, talk about our long-term solutions, and then at the same time, preserve our credibility by talking about how we're going to do that. What are the plans to achieve our goals? What are the stepping stones along the way? What are the possible and even likely timelines? What it would take to achieve our goals and objectives? And then the second thing I think that we need to do differently than we have at some points in our past is to run an extremely credible, extremely professional campaign. This is why I have 20 people on our professional team already. We're virtually ready for the general election now. We preserve our credibility not only by discussing, as I just mentioned, plans, how we're going to get there, details of our fairly transformational ideas, but we also spend significant time leaning into my own background of public service and public policy, both as a professional economist and as a police officer.
One of the things that I think concern a lot of people when they think about libertarian candidates, even those who are generally might be fiscally conservative, is they have this impression that, oh, those libertarians, like, they want to just like totally shut down federal government and just it's everybody's out for themselves and good luck to you. Where do you stand on like how small should federal government be in your mind? Should there be anything, or should it just be like, a couple guys on the border and that's it, or what?
It should be extremely small by the standards that you've described it. I believe that the only role for federal government is to provide some national defense. By the way, that does not include projecting military hegemony around the world. I believe that we need to close foreign bases. We need to shut down foreign aid. We need to bring troops home. We should not be threatening to get into a war with China over Taiwan. I believe that we should not be funding the war in Ukraine. I do not believe that we should be members of NATO any longer. There is no ethical reason or objective empirical reason why anyone should be arguing that we should be spending 3, 4, or more percentage points of our GDP when members of NATO in Europe are spending less and depending on us to be their plan A in terms of defense. I think that's an ethical proposition, and I think it's, objectively speaking, an empirical problem to back up the idea that that's good policy. I also believe that in terms of domestic politics and policy, that we need to critically shrink the size and scope of the federal government's footprint in our lives. You don't have to go very far back in history to see the idea that the government has taken to itself the right to tell us we should be taking a vaccine. However you believe in a vaccine, it could be the greatest thing since sliced bread. That does not mean that any government should assume to itself the right to coerce an individual to take it. Government should not have the right to shut down your business, tell you you have to wear a mask, tell you how to behave. The government should not be in the business of bailing out businesses. It should not be in the business of controlling how businesses behave. And a subject that I know is near and dear to you, the government should not be in the business of transferring money from one person to another in any form, least of all telling people go ahead and take out student loans and then afterwards forgiving them at the expense of the rest of taxpayers. That's not just a mathematical issue. That's not just an issue of economics. That's an ethical problem. That's a representation of a set of values that does not align with where most Americans are.
Yeah, the student loan one's an interesting one. I think in polling, a lot of people are in favor of it. I personally feel
polling
like
shows that the vast majority of Americans are against the idea of forgiving debt.
Oh, okay. Maybe it's the certain demographics that would benefit from the forgiveness of those loans. But my view is like if someone decided not to go to pursue let's say a 4-year kind of college degree because they ran the numbers and they're like, I don't think it's worth it for me to spend, that much money. I'd rather deploy it towards starting a business or going to trade school or whatever, paying down personal debt. And then later on, we forgive the neighbor's debt who went and, got a degree in something that, they thought was interesting, but isn't paying off in the private, in the markets. Like, why? That seems unfair. Secondly, it seems like it doesn't discourage the universities from just raising tuition by greater than inflation every year, because I guess the government will forgive it later and it's not really a problem.
Well, you're exactly right. And to your point, I would argue it's even worse than what you described, in the sense that not only is it unfair that someone should be given an advantage just because of a decision they made, but the forgiveness is at your expense. You're the one who decided, I'm not going to go to a 4-year school. I am not going to take out money to pay for my education. It's these people that have to pay for the others. It's not as though the forgiveness of debt is free. It has to be paid by someone. That money came from somewhere. It came from everybody else. So not only is it unfair, but it's profoundly unethical. You're taking money from one group of people and just handing it to another group of people. And you're absolutely right that the unfairness is between these two groups of people, but also consider the following. Even if you were successful in building a career based on your college education, the government still wants to forgive your debt. They're not drawing a distinction between how well things have gone. That's a little weird. And consider that you're right. Not only does it not discourage universities from raising tuition without, critical accountability to the market, but it also doesn't discourage individuals from taking into consideration all the factors they should in making these decisions. You're going to make worse decisions if the government is subsidizing one particular avenue, and that's not necessarily the avenue down which we should be going. So markets work in education, markets work in the financing of education, and we need to allow them to work. If we undermine them, we'll never get the adjustments that we need to make. And those adjustments include, to your point, universities keeping tuition down and individuals making good decisions about, in many cases, not going to college.
Let's talk about something that my wife and I had an argument about this morning, a very cordial one, but we disagreed. She said, hey, what do you think the Senate is going to do on banning TikTok? And I said, I'm not for it. And she said, well, why? Like, how can you be okay with China having all of this data? And my argument was like, this is a slippery slope. If you want to regulate what companies do with data, that's fine with me. But you can't just ban a company and say, sell yourself in 6 months or else. That seems like the government really playing a heavy hand in a competitive marketplace. What is your take? Because I think there are legitimate concerns, which is, well, if I were to play the other side, I think the argument would be that might be true, but we've never been in a position where such an influential technology was potentially controlled by a foreign entity. We've always been the companies, it was American companies that had all the power. So we never had to worry as much about ourselves. But here it is, domiciled somewhere else with all this data. What's your take on TikTok?
Well, first of all, you are exactly correct with regard to the public policy. So let's come back to that in just a moment. But first, and more important than the public policy, is that you need to go to your wife and say, your concerns are exactly right. I was an insensitive son of a bitch, and you are a woman who is too good for me, and I am damned lucky to be able to live with you and spend my life with someone like you. She is right to be sensitive to the issue of sharing all this data with the Chinese government. No question about it. And I would go so far as to say, I'm okay with discouraging Americans from using TikTok. It's okay with me if you want to lead a campaign that says, hey, let's not give up all of our data to TikTok. It goes to the Chinese government. It can be used against us in a national security way. It can undermine elections. It can compromise our security. It can compromise our privacy. All these are legitimate concerns. Indeed, maybe one of the ways to do that is not just simply dropping the use of TikTok, but starting other companies that can provide similar platforms that are not tied to the Chinese government. All that is completely legitimate in terms of concerns and reactions and activism against that. As a matter of public policy, you're right. We can't have the government just unilaterally deciding that a company cannot do business in the United States or that it needs to divest itself in one direction or another in order to do business in the United States. We absolutely can't have that. And you are also right. The irony of the U.S. federal government being upset about a corporation with ties to another government when the federal government of the United States imposes on all of these platforms that they share data with the federal government, that they moderate content according to what the White House wants. The irony is that the federal government of the United States has a much heavier hand in terms of playing a role in social media in the United States with American companies than the Chinese government does with TikTok. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese government won't with TikTok. Indeed, it probably will. But up until now, it is indeed the U.S. federal government that has been leading the charge in interrupting a completely capitalistic approach to the First Amendment inside the United States. So as a matter of public policy, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Let's talk about climate. I think this would challenge your small government approach, and I'll make a case for government involvement, and I would love to hear your thoughts. I could argue that absent any government regulation, private corporations, with their main objective being to produce shareholder value in the near term, will do things that might harm the public good in the long run. And then we all have to pay for it. We'll all suffer from it. And left to their own devices, like no company will, unilaterally or voluntarily restrict, let's say car emissions, like you needed those standards in place. What's your, did you, yeah, I'm back.
It is true that it is unlikely that corporations would unilaterally do things that are not in their own interest. But I do not believe that it is true that corporations would not be forced through other means to take into consideration the public good. I also think, and let's come back and talk about that in a moment. I also think it's very hard to argue that the structure that we have in place today, which is to say that the regulation comes from the government, it's very hard to argue that this has gone well. The government is not particularly good at it. The relationship between government and corporations is rife with corruption. There is an absence of feedback to promote efficiency or economic growth. It also needs to be said that the vast majority of what needs to be done regarding reacting to climate change, for example, is to deploy resources to react to the climate change itself rather than stopping it. And in that sense, you absolutely don't want the federal government or any other government involved in directing the resources that are required to react to changes in climate. But back to the regulatory framework, it is just not true that the private sector would not regulate what it is that corporations do, both from the standpoint of manufacturers coming together and setting out objectives and rules, as well as private sector consumer groups getting together and setting out rules and objectives in the absence of the federal government, because it would represent the interests of consumers. For example, no automobile manufacturer wants to be on the wrong side of consumer sentiment. And let's be honest, it's not that the government woke up one day and had a bunch of data that nobody else had, and all of a sudden was smarter than the rest of us and decided that there was climate change that no one else knew anything about, and knew about CO2 emissions that nobody else knew about, and therefore set out a bunch of regulations. That's just not how it works, and that's not how it worked. The way that it worked was pressure from the public brought pressure on the federal government, and the federal government reacted by pressuring the private sector. But there is no real empirical objective reason to believe that it has to work that way. If we had a federal government that was dedicated to not engaging in the regulation of corporations by force, which is, of course, what invites the corruption that we see in the relationship between corporations and the federal government. If we had such a federal government, you would see public pressure turning into consumer groups that would bring the pressure more directly. And I believe absolutely that it would be more efficient and effective. I'm not suggesting that there wouldn't be regulation. I'm just suggesting that the way that we do it today is dopey.
All right. I will take some questions from the live audience for you in a second. I just have one last question from me, Mike. What is your take on the talk about RFK Jr. Accessing the ballot via a Libertarian Party nomination? I don't see him as he doesn't scream Libertarian to me. In some ways he does. I mean, with the vaccine stuff, maybe. But do you feel like he's an interloper, or are you glad to see him, being talked about? What's your take?
It's not a big deal on my radar screen, to be honest. You are right. He is not a libertarian. I do not believe he is going to seek the nomination of our party. And the reason for that is that if he were to seek the nomination of our party, he would fail. And given his brand already in existence, I don't believe that his campaign could afford such a failure. I think that would be a black mark on their campaign, and not one that they should be inviting easily. So I do not believe that he will seek our party's nomination, and for good reason. You're right. With regard to the vaccines, he has been skeptical of the government's role and the government's mandate that people take the vaccine. But this is not because he believes, as we do, in a complete separation of the government from all things science, all things medical, all things personal, all things family decisions, corporate decisions, and individual decisions. The reason he believes in getting rid of vaccine mandates is because he doesn't like the vaccines themselves. Whereas, from a libertarian point of view, I don't care how great the vaccine is. It could be a perfect vaccine. It could be a vaccine guaranteed to save your life, guaranteed you're going to die without it. It has no side effects. It's perfectly free. Even with a perfect vaccine, the government does not have the authority, the ethical, moral responsibility or right to tell you to take a vaccine, no matter how good it is.
Ooh, I'm going to resist the urge to go down that discussion because it would be a long one. Well, maybe I'll just say one thing and let you reply, and then we'll go to the to the audience questions. Because while I generally am sympathetic to the libertarian view that, hey, people should decide what they do with their life, I think in a pandemic situation where you're worried about the spread of a virus and you've got the risk of people going into public areas and transmitting it, doesn't that somehow cross over from like, no, this is not just me making a decision. Like now I'm impacting my neighbors, the other people in the supermarket or on the bus or whatever. How do you kind of reconcile that potential risk?
And you probably should take that into consideration. I didn't suggest that you shouldn't.
Okay. So you're not you could you see a situation where either a vaccine requirement is in place or that access to congested public areas with high transmission rates have a requirement that you are vaccinated or have
No,
proof that you have?
absolutely
Okay.
not. That is an ethical problem. It's a government legitimacy problem. We're not even getting to the fact that the government is not qualified, is not smart enough, is not good at developing those decisions, is not good at enforcing those decisions, is not good at being honest with what it knows. Never mind all of that, right? Which is important, but set all of that aside. The government does not have the legitimate moral authority to tell you what you do with your body, that you should be injecting something into your body. There is nothing that should trump what you should be allowed to do in your personal life. If you are afraid of getting the virus, and maybe you should be afraid of getting I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't be. And if you believe that a vaccine would help protect you, again, I'm not suggesting that a vaccine wouldn't help protect you or would. And if you believe that it would help shut down transmissibility, that there is some public obligation there, then yes, do the right thing, make a good decision. Who should be making that decision? If you and I agree on what the right decision is, and maybe we don't agree on what the right decision is, but whatever the right decision is, who should be the arbiter of that? The government represents supposedly the will of the people. Shouldn't individuals be making those decisions for themselves? And if not, what are you going to do about it? And we have an excellent test case, Tom, because you only have to go back 2 years to find that the government decision-making was not only an ethical violation of Americans' values, it was also, objectively speaking, a bad set of decisions, empirically speaking. The damage done to our economy exceeded the value of imposing government shutdowns, vaccine requirements, mask requirements relative to the behavior that people would have taken onto themselves anyway. And we know this by comparing to the way that other nations outside of America handle the situation. Whether you look at it ethically or whether you look at it empirically, the federal government of the United States blew the last one. And I don't trust them to get it right next time.
Let me see if I can stress test your libertarian views a little bit here. I'm not. I think you have a fair argument to make around, in hindsight, now that we have all the data, what should have been the optimal public health kind of response to the pandemic. What about maybe I'll take an extreme example where I would imagine you would agree the government should have a right to encroach on a person's individual liberties. Let's say a person who drinks and drives. Someone could argue it's my body, it's my car, I'm going to drink if I want. I would argue, well, I'm sharing the road with you. My kids are riding their bikes in the neighborhood. Like, I don't want drunk people driving around. Would you agree on that? That would be an example where you can regulate people's behavior?
Not drinking, driving.
Yes, driving while drunk. That is totally not okay.
I agree 100%.
Okay. I'm glad let's park that for a moment. We'll take that as a win.
We found some base commonality. I agree with
you. Okay. Jonathan asked a clarification question. Is he on the ballot in all states? I think if you get the nomination, isn't the Libertarian Party like you're kind of pre-approved to be on most states, right? Or
last time we were on all 50 state ballots. This time we have not yet achieved it. It is still up in the air whether we're going to make it in New York and Illinois. We're going to be working our asses off over the next couple of months to achieve that. I believe that we probably will succeed, but I cannot guarantee that today.
Okay, great. Sue, who's a channel member, asked, hey, I noticed End the Fed and Drain the Swamp on Mike's website. I would like to learn more about them. What do you... Oh yeah, End the Fed. That sounds pretty material. Like, what do you mean by that?
It is fairly material. I believe that our dollar would be much stronger if we had a completely different monetary policy rather than what it is the Fed does today. Remember, what the Fed does today is, in effect, and I don't mean this is any exaggeration. Today, the way it works is we lock up 12 people that we think are really smart every 6 weeks in a room and ask them basically what mood they're in regarding the economy. I don't think there are too many people who would argue that's a good way to set any price, much less interest rates and how they affect the value of our currency. I believe that we need to completely change our monetary policy to a rules-based system, get discretionary monetary policy out of it. I believe we need to stop bailing out banking institutions. I believe that we need to get the Fed out of regulating banking institutions altogether. This is where this silly idea comes from that some institutions are too big to fail. We need to get the Fed out of the idea of issuing its own currency on blockchain technology, which would completely screw up the development of that market. For all of these reasons, we need to get the Fed out of our lives. And by the way, I've just named all of the functions of the Fed. So yes, we need to completely end the Federal Reserve System, lock, stock, and barrel.
Drain the swamp was something that the previous president talked about. What is your definition of draining the swamp?
And people before that. A couple of different things. One is that we need to pare back the extent to which the government not at the politically appointed level, but at the civil servant level, thinks that it can just continue to expand and expand and expand. It now, includes 1 million employees. It's extremely expensive. And more importantly, it operates in the shadows. It is not fully accountable to anyone. Certainly the leadership of the civil service do not stand for any sort of elections. They just sort of put one foot in front of the other and continue on with the regulatory state. We need to limit the extent to which the federal government is able to regulate our lives. We need to hold these folks accountable. One of the big ways that we do that is by breaking up some of these agencies and redeploying their employees. In many cases, you can reduce the workforce. I believe more importantly, we need to make most federal regulation, and this can be handled through executive order, make most federal regulations subject to the approval of individual governors in their respective states. This would give states the opportunity to chart their own political future. It may not matter in a place like California, right? I'm guessing that the California state exec and legislature would welcome the idea of imposing greater regulation, not restricting regulation. But in many states, and we're only looking for a couple as examples, but I believe in many states, governors will in effect veto federal regulation, given the opportunity to do so, and create a competitive environment into which to welcome new businesses and existing businesses growing, and create examples of leadership to the rest of the states. This, I think, is absolutely critical to the future development of our economy.
All right, Mike, we have a few more questions from the audience, and then we'll let you go. This has been a great conversation. Let's try and bang through these. Hormone blockers for kids. Whose choice is that? Should it be anyone's choice? Should it be the kid's choice, the parent's choice? What's your take on that?
Well, it has to be in part something that the individual participates in, right? The individual undergoing the treatment has to participate in the decision to undergo what is, after all, a discretionary treatment, and a treatment that is going to affect that individual in the most fundamental ways forever, right? There is no bigger decision that could be made. An individual has to be able to participate in that. It can't be merely the parents. For an individual to participate in that fully, which is to say, understand the ramifications, understand the alternatives, understand the risks, understand all of the factors at play that might be affecting your decision, that individual has to be an adult in some sense. There is no way a child would be able to process all of that information in a legitimate way. And this is exactly why our society, as a community, as a nation, as a culture, we demand that for certain activities, an age of consent be reached, because we do not believe that children are able to make certain decisions for themselves, and that we do not allow parents to make those decisions unilaterally for the children, that the children have to reach an age of consent to be able to participate in these decisions. This falls into that category. Fundamentally, this is something that should require an age of consent to be reached. This is the reason why we as a society ask individuals to wait to make these decisions.
I think I know the answer to this one, but Sue wanted to make sure we understood your position on Israel and Gaza. What is
Israel
your take?
did not come up, Sue. You did not miss it. But I did say that we need to get out of the business of foreign aid. With regard to Israel, look, I understand that this feels very different than the other examples, right? It feels different than Ukraine. It feels different than Taiwan. It even in some sense feels different than NATO. You know, a lot of us have important, profound connections to Israel. I personally have traveled Israel north, south, east, west. I have done so with my family. I've sent my daughter to her friend's bat mitzvah there. I have traveled the Middle East. I've sent my son to train in Jordan. So I get it. I've traveled the Palestinian territory. My team has family there. And a prominent member of the Libertarian Party recently announced having lost a cousin to the war in Gaza. So I get it. This feels extremely personal. Having said that, we need to take this opportunity to make the point on a principled basis, not based on how much we like Israel or how much we feel badly for Palestinians or people living in Gaza, how badly we feel for Israelis who were killed and whose families were disrupted, whose lives were ruined in October. Notwithstanding all of these important, legitimate feelings, right? We need to be able to make decisions regarding our foreign policy based on principle. It can't be based on affiliations that are developed in advance. We need to have an independent foreign policy. Foreign aid doesn't work. It's a bad investment. Israel is a perfect example of a tremendous amount of foreign aid, billions of dollars, that has left us with a situation where we have an important ally in the Middle East, an important democratic ally in the Middle East, but one over which we do not have any serious influence. They're going to do whatever they're going to do. But because we have given them billions of dollars, the American government is held accountable for Israeli decisions, Israeli government decisions. That's no way to run a foreign policy. And by the way, if I were advising the Israeli government, and I'm not, nor am I in the business of trying to offer advice to the Israeli government, I would have suggested to them long ago that they give up the idea of accepting foreign aid from the United States. I believe that they would be much better suited to their political future if they were viewed as being completely independent.
All right, Mike, last question. And I know we said we'd do this in 30 minutes and we're at 56. So, but it's been
Thanks
super
for hanging
fun.
in there.
No, it's been great. I mean, we covered a lot of ground. And here's another one. Not exactly an easy question. What is your take on immigration? President Biden got into some hot water at the State of the Union for using the term illegals. I think President Trump has a very strong view on immigration. What is your take on the southern border and how immigration works in America?
I also have very strong feelings about this. Indeed, I've been to the border. I was down there for a couple of days at the Arizona-Mexico border last year. And the one thing that I came away being really impressed by is the extent to which we have a horrific humanitarian crisis due to the black market and human trafficking across the border. Most people who come into the United States come in illegally. And most people who come in illegally do so through the use of some form of black market trafficking service, gangs, coyotes on the other side. And then they're handed off on the American side to people they don't know, usually using some cell phone based app, right? And in far too many cases, these are people who are handed over into some form of indentured servitude. This is something that we need to shut down. It's a bad look for the United States. It's a bad way to run foreign policy. It's a bad way to run domestic policy. It is completely unethical. It runs completely counter to the libertarian idea that the only reason government should exist is to protect individual liberties. Wow, talk about not protecting people. Our government has created a black market at the border, has created this humanitarian crisis. So we need a fundamentally different style of border policy, I believe. Having said that, as an economist, as well as an American, I recognize that immigration is good for the United States. It's good for us economically. It's good for us financially. It is very good for us culturally in every way. We need more immigration, not less immigration. We need to be good at getting people in the United States safely and more rapidly. I'm not a big fan of deploying federal resources for any purpose, right? But I would be up for redeploying federal resources away from the military industrial complex to the legal vetting of people across the border. This idea that it should take days, weeks, months, years to vet people across the border is utter bullshit. We need to put the technology in place to rapidly determine if you're on a list, if there's a felony warrant, if you're on a terrorist watch list, and by the way those lists are put together is a load of crap as well. But if there's a legitimate reason to believe that you should not be coming to the United States, that's one thing. But if you're not on one of these lists, the presumption should be you're good to go. Welcome to the United States. And by the way, this idea of you're allowed in, but you're not allowed to work, wow, that is backwards. I would be more comfortable with a policy that says, you better go to work. I'm going to call you in 6 weeks and make sure you have a job. Why are we in the business of recruiting people in the United States under the pretense that we're not going to let you work? That is just completely backwards. And by the way our policy works now is that we create another black market in labor, right? We allow too many businesses to take advantage of individuals because they're not allowed to work legally. So they work for low wages, undermining the wage rates of other Americans who are already in the United States. It's just wrong and backwards any way you look at it. So we need to vet people across more rapidly. We need to get a hold of our border to stop people from coming in illegally. It's dangerous for them. It's bad policy for us. And this is why I always say legal immigration is good for the United States. Illegal immigration is bad for the United States. We need more legal immigration and we need less illegal immigration.
Mike, it's been a pleasure having you in the Nerd Zone. I want to give you any final closing remarks, or if you want to direct people where they can learn more about you or pitch in if they feel like they want to get involved. Now's your time to share.
Well, I appreciate that. In 60 seconds, let me mention that you can go to MikeTermott.com. You can learn everything you need to know about the campaign. Yes, if you want to get involved, we would love to have you. I assume everyone out there is a nerd. We can always use more nerds. My personal contact information is on there, but so is the contact information for all the others on our professional team. So you can reach out to any one of us and get involved. If you just feel like making a donation, knock yourself out. Campaigns run on cash. There's no question about that. If Mike Termott is too difficult to spell because there's 2 A's in Termott, you can go to goldnewdeal.org, which is easier to spell. That's the platform's website. The 2 websites connect back and forth. And nerds, here's your call to duty. We have an artificial intelligence bot up and running called Lisa. You can connect there from the other websites. I understand it's down for retraining today, but it'll be up next week. And I think you'll enjoy seeing it. It's in beta phase, but at the end of May, it'll be hardcore up and running to spread libertarianism. And I think all of the nerds out there are going to enjoy playing with it, getting to know it, using it, and advising me when you find that it's giving answers you don't like.
I appreciate it, Mike. Good luck on the trail, and I'll be following your campaign and the Libertarian convention with great interest. Stay safe out there, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. You stay safe too. Stay nerdly, and congratulations on a great program you have. It's been a great joy to be a part of it.
You bet. Take care, Mike. Bye. All right. By the way, so you guys are saying in the chat that my brother is in the chat. Under what name is he appearing? Is my brother Dr. Spider? I don't think so. I don't know if my brother is that his new identity? I don't think so. Dr. Spider, that's not Pete, is it? Anyway, regardless, I'm going to give you my takeaways from this interview. I have some thoughts. But before I do that, I got to thank the channel members, and I'm not going to forget to put on my closing music, because this is music that was composed just for this show. And it was partly because of our channel member support that we can do things like that to kind of make our content a little more fun. So who are these channel members? We'll start with our biggest supporter, And if you want to become a supporter, you just go to YouTube and click the join link on the Nerds for Humanity channel. It starts at $1.99 a month. We're not quite at a point where we're at break even, but someday we will be. And then that'll let you join and help keep this content going. So our biggest supporter is Soldier One. Soldier One is a senior vice president of the channel, and he is amazing. He's been a supporter for damn near 46 months. So thank you, Soldier One. At the VP level, the Officer Corps, we have Kristen Slevin and Bike. Both of these have been VPs for years now, and couldn't thank them enough. And Kristen's been supporting the channel for 50 months. Hardcore, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Mr. History, Mona, Vaughn, Yang, Dean, Galessa, Jay Perrin, Dana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey, Yoda, Jackson, Unkiyu, and Bobby. And then at the entry level, verified nerds, I'm going to scroll through all of you amazing verified nerds. $1.99 a month. Very much appreciate it. By the way, if you like audio podcasts, go ahead and subscribe to the audio podcast because we pay for hosting those audio files. Okay, my takeaways. Number one, Mike is a very articulate candidate. I might argue even more articulate at length than Trump or Biden. You know, it is what it is that the two leading parties have given us the candidates that they have. Number two is, as much as I have some libertarian kind of tendencies, you know, I do believe like the FDA, the EPA, you know, DOJ, IRS, I believe that they do good things. I agree they could be way more efficient and they're probably very wasteful in some ways, but I'm not quite ready to cut the federal government at the rate that I think Mike would. But I respect the intellectual kind of clarity that he has. And then the last takeaway is, you wonder if a third party, what effect that the Libertarian Party and RFK Jr. and No Labels are going to have. And are we going to end up with Trump and Biden, neither of them getting the 270, and then the House of Representatives picking our president? That will be interesting. It sounds like it's going to be an interesting year. Personally, I was hoping that Biden would have dropped out by now. I think that State of the Union gave him a very strong second wind. And frankly, if he can keep it up and win in November, and, you know, I think I would prefer that over Trump. If he decided that he wanted to focus on finishing the term strong and the party wanted to go with, you know, Whitmer Booker kind of combo, like, very okay with that as well. In fact, more than okay with that. And then, the last thing I'll share is I'm trying to get Dean Phillips onto the channel. Obviously, his campaign is suspended. But in some ways, you know, those candidate interviews after the campaign is sometimes more interesting because they can kind of let their hair down a little bit. And, you know, I'd love to talk with Dean for an hour, just like we did with Mike. So if any of you want to see that, I have been pushing for it on Twitter, or if you want to nudge Dean and say, hey, you should come on the Nerds channel, that would be amazing. I'd love to get on his busy calendar. I know he's got a lot going on as a congressman, but I think he would enjoy the conversation. So you just got to let him know that he's welcome in the Nerd Zone, and it would be a good use of his time. If you can help me out by encouraging him to do that, that would be amazing. I'm also trying to get Yang back on, so hopefully we'll have some other cool guests for you real soon. with that, I'm going to say goodbye, nerds.